She's dead, Bobby! She's dead!
It's just a dream, Judy. She's fine.
I never believed in premonitions until December 23, 1981, when a mother's nightmare became a detective's worst-case file. What happened in Valdis, North Carolina, that winter night still makes seasoned investigators shake their heads 43 years later, because sometimes the impossible leaves evidence that can't be explained away. Picture this small mountain town in 1981, where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night high school football games. Valdis sits nestled in the Appalachian foothills, where the morning mist clings to the ridgelines and the smell of wood smoke from chimneys mingles with the crisp December air. Bobby and Judy Henson had lived there their whole lives, raised their daughter Rhonda in a modest house on Mineral Springs Mountain, where the sound of rushing creek water was your alarm clock and your neighbors were more like extended family. But at exactly 1 a.m. on December 23rd, something shattered that peaceful mountain silence. Judy Henson bolted upright in bed like she'd been struck by lightning, her cotton nightgown soaked through with sweat, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The bedroom was pitch black, that deep mountain darkness where you can't see your hand in front of your face, but she could sense something was terribly, horribly wrong. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a nightmare, it was knowledge. Pure, undeniable knowledge that felt like ice water in her veins. Her hands trembling, she shook Bobby awake with a desperation he'd never seen in their 25 years of marriage. "Bobby, wake up right now." When his eyes opened, the panic in her voice made him sit up instantly. "She's dead, Bobby," Judy whispered, tears already streaming down her cheeks. "Our Rhonda. She's dead." The words hung in that mountain air like a curse nobody wanted to believe. Bobby tried everything to calm her down, told her it was just a bad dream, that their 19-year-old daughter was probably fast asleep in her apartment, or maybe still at that Christmas party at Hickory Steel. But Judy was absolutely insistent, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. She jumped out of bed, her bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor, and grabbed the rotary phone with shaking fingers. She called Caldwell Memorial Hospital first, describing a young woman with long brown hair, about 5'4", asking if anyone matching that description had been admitted. Nothing. Then she called their family friend Martha, voice breaking, asking if she'd heard anything about Rhonda. Nothing. Finally, Bobby called the American Legion hut in Hickory, where the Christmas party had been held. The person who answered confirmed yes. Rhonda had been there earlier, left around 11 with her friend Sherry, seemed fine, had a good time. Bobby hung up and turned to his wife, relief flooding his voice. "See, honey, she's okay. She left the party safe and sound." For a moment, just a moment, Judy's rigid shoulders began to relax. Maybe she really had been having a nightmare. Maybe her mother's intuition had just gone haywire. But that sense of relief lasted exactly until 4:30 a.m., when they heard heavy footsteps on their front porch and the slow, deliberate knock that every parent dreads. When Judy opened that door and saw 2 North Carolina state troopers standing there with their hats in their hands, she knew. She'd been right all along. If you've ever had a premonition that came true, go ahead and drop "happened" in the comments, because what I'm about to tell you gets much stranger. 20 miles away, on Interstate 40 near the Mineral Springs Mountain Highway off-ramp, 4 college boys were driving home from a late-night party, windows down, radio playing some Def Leppard, just enjoying that freedom you feel when you're young and the whole world feels like it's yours. The December air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine trees and that particular smell mountain air gets right before snow. They were probably going too fast, laughing too loud, the way young men do when they think they're invincible. That's when Tommy, riding shotgun, pointed ahead and said something that changed everything. "Hey, you'll see that?" About 50 yards ahead, there was something in the roadside ditch that didn't belong. As they got closer, their headlights illuminated a car, engine still running, headlights cutting through the darkness, driver's side door hanging wide open like someone had just vanished into thin air. The radio was still playing, some late-night country station, creating this eerie soundtrack to a scene that made their skin crawl. They pulled over immediately, thinking someone had hit a deer or swerved to avoid something and gone to find help. But when they examined the scene, nothing added up. There were no skid marks, no impact damage, no broken glass. This car had simply rolled backward across the opposite lane and settled gently into that ditch, like someone had just parked it there. The engine was purring softly, the headlights were perfect, even the radio antenna was intact. That's when one of them called out from about 30 feet away, his voice cracking with fear. "Guys! Over here!" There in the ditch, lying on her back with her arms positioned carefully at her sides, was a young woman. She looked almost peaceful, like she'd just decided to lie down under the December stars and take a nap. But even from a distance, even in that dim light, they could tell she wasn't sleeping. Death has a stillness that you recognize instinctively, a complete absence of the small movements that make a person alive. They ran back to their car, hands shaking as they fumbled for change to call 911 from the nearest payphone. When the police arrived, the scene made even less sense. This young woman, later identified as 19-year-old RHONDA Henson, showed no signs of trauma, no blood, no indication of a struggle. But the positioning of her body was deliberate, careful, like someone had taken time to arrange her with respect. Her car told a different story entirely. During the investigation, they found a single bullet hole in the trunk that had continued through the back seat, through the driver's seat, indicating she'd been shot from behind while driving. The theory was that she'd been struck while behind the wheel, causing the car to roll backward into the ditch, and then someone had removed her body and positioned it in that respectful, almost ritualistic way. But who? And why? The autopsy revealed that single round bruise under her breast and DNA evidence on the driver's door handle that didn't match Rhonda's. Someone else had been there, someone who'd touched that door, someone who'd moved her body. But here's where this story gets absolutely chilling, and if you think that's strange, wait until you hear what the witnesses saw. Multiple people reported seeing a blue Chevrolet parked along that off-ramp around 1 a.m., right around the time Judy Henson was jolting awake 20 miles away. 2 men were seen sitting in that car, just waiting, like they were expecting something. Another witness drove past and saw something that still gives investigators nightmares. A car in the road, a young woman slumped over the steering wheel, and a man standing at the driver's side door. Just standing there in the darkness, like he was contemplating what to do next. Rhonda had been living in constant fear for weeks before that night. This vibrant young woman who just graduated high school, who worked as a clerical worker at Hickory Steel, who lived with Bobby and Judy on Mineral Springs Mountain, had become a different person entirely. She'd started asking her father to accompany her on trips into town, something she'd never done before. She'd begun taking showers in the middle of the night, and when her parents asked why, she said she felt dirty. The most chilling detail? She'd asked her mother if it was acceptable to date a married man, then quickly claimed she was asking for a friend when Judy pressed her about it. The night she died, Rhonda had gone to that Christmas party at the American Legion hut. Her friend Sherry Pittman had convinced her to go, even though her boyfriend Greg McDowell wasn't attending. While getting ready, Rhonda received 3 phone calls from Greg, each one taken privately in her bedroom, each conversation she never shared with anyone. At 11 p.m., she left the party with Sherry, dropped her off around 11:50, then made one final phone call to Greg from Sherry's house. Whatever was said in that call left Rhonda visibly upset, and her last words before leaving were haunting. "I had better go." She never made it home. Her route was simple, Interstate 40 to the Mineral Springs Mountain Highway off-ramp, less than half a mile from her family's house. Instead, she ended up in that ditch, her life ended by someone who knew where she'd be and when she'd be there. The investigation revealed items in her car that hadn't been there when she'd left for the party. A letter jacket, a wooden bowl, a pink stuffed snake that was a souvenir from a trip she'd taken with Greg. Someone had deliberately placed these items there, someone with access to them and knowledge of her movements. Greg McDowell, her boyfriend, told police he'd been driving a burgundy 1981 Toyota that night, but witnesses described different vehicles. He had no solid alibi, but there was no conclusive physical evidence linking him to the crime. The DNA was never matched, the murder weapon was never found, and perhaps most mysteriously, multiple people at the scene were allegedly allowed to leave without being identified in police reports. Who were they? What had they seen? What did they know? The case remains unsolved after 43 years, but it's not just another cold case file gathering dust. It's part of a pattern that challenges everything we think we know about the connection between mothers and their children, about intuition and the supernatural, about the thin veil between life and death. Because Judy Henson's Midnight Awakening was just the beginning of a story that spans decades and crosses the boundary between the living and the dead. On the evening of June 10, 1994, 13 years after Rhonda's murder, another mother experienced something impossible. Deborah Hoy was in Sacramento with her husband, tossing and turning in a hotel bed, when something inside her began screaming that they needed to leave immediately. Not in the morning as planned, but right now, in the middle of the night. They needed to drive home to Lake Tahoe, and they needed to go now. Her husband thought she'd lost her mind. It was midnight, they were comfortable, they'd planned to leave in the morning anyway. But Deborah's desperation was so intense, so consuming, that she convinced him to pack up and start the 3-hour drive through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Something was pulling her east on Highway 50, something she couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. At 2 a.m., they reached Bullion Bend, that winding stretch of highway that cuts through dense forest where the trees seem to lean in and swallow your headlights. Deborah was staring out the passenger window at the dark pines flashing by when she saw something that stopped her heart. There on the edge of the pavement, completely naked, was a woman lying on her side with one arm tucked under her head like she was sleeping peacefully. The other arm was draped across her face, as if she was trying to hide from something terrible. "Did you see that?" Deborah grabbed her husband's arm so hard she left marks. He had seen it. They both had. By the time he hit the brakes, they were already past her, and when he started to turn around, Deborah stopped him. Something about the scene felt wrong, dangerous, like they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to see. They found a payphone miles up the road and called 911, their voices shaking as they reported a naked woman on Highway 50 near mile marker 16. Highway patrol officers responded within the hour, searched the exact spot Deborah described, checked the shoulders and embankments. Nothing. No sign anyone had ever been there. Over the next few hours, 2 other drivers called in similar reports, but every time officers responded, they found absolutely nothing. The authorities figured it was a prank or maybe drunk college students playing a sick joke. But the next morning, Deputy Rich Strasser of the El Dorado County Sheriff's Department heard about these strange sightings, and something clicked. He'd been working a missing person case, a young mother named Christine Skubish and her 3-year-old son Nick, who had vanished 5 days earlier while driving through these same mountains. The mother's aunt had called with something bizarre, a dream about a car in a ditch and the number 16. Strasser drove to Bullion Bend in daylight, focusing on the area around mile marker 16, and there it was. A small black tennis shoe on the gravel shoulder, a child's shoe. He walked to the edge of the embankment, and 40 feet down through thick pine trees and brush, he saw a flash of red metal. His blood turned to ice as he scrambled down that slope, pine needles sliding under his boots, branches tearing at his uniform. The red metal was a Hyundai, completely hidden from the road, its roof torn off like a can opener had been taken to it. Still strapped to the driver's seat was Christine Skubish, dead for 5 days. But there was movement in the back. Curled in a fetal position on the floor was 3-year-old Nick, naked, covered in scratches and insect bites, barely breathing. The paramedics said he had maybe 1 or 2 hours left when they found him. 5 days and nights, This child had been trapped in that car with his dead mother, had somehow survived hypothermia, dehydration, and complete terror. Here's what investigators piece together, and what makes this story absolutely impossible to explain. On June 5th, Christine had left Sacramento with Nick, driving to Carson City to start a new life. Around 2 a.m. on June 6th, exhausted, she'd fallen asleep at the wheel. The car drifted off the pavement at Bullion Bend and plunged into the ravine. Christine died on impact, but Nick survived, trapped for 5 days with his mother's body. So who was the naked woman Deborah Hoy saw on the road 5 days later? When Deborah saw Christine's photo in the news, she gasped and nearly fainted. That was her. That was absolutely the woman she'd seen lying on Highway 50. But there's a problem with that identification that defies every law of physics and biology. Christine had been dead for 4 days by the time Deborah saw her, and she was strapped to a driver's seat 40 feet below the road. Some skeptics suggest Deborah saw Nick, that maybe in the darkness a small naked child could be mistaken for a woman. But Deborah insists that's not what she saw, and she's never wavered from her story. Others wonder if Christine's spirit was trying to flag down help for her dying son, if somehow in those final desperate hours when Nick was slipping away from hypothermia and dehydration, his mother found a way to appear on that highway just long enough to make sure someone would look for him. All the sightings that night were near mile marker 16, the exact number from her aunt's prophetic dream. Today, Nick Skubish is in his 30s and remembers much of his time trapped in that wreckage. Christine's family doesn't talk about what Deborah saw, but many people wonder if a mother's love really can transcend death, if the bond between parent and child is strong enough to bridge the gap between this world and whatever comes next. But if you think that story challenges reality, wait until you hear about what happened in 1897 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, because that case involves something that had never happened before in American legal history and has never happened since. In late February of 1897, Mary Jane Hester couldn't sleep. Her 24-year-old daughter Zona had been dead for 4 weeks, and grief had completely consumed her. But beyond the crushing pain was a feeling that something about Zona's death wasn't right. Zona had married Erasmus Stribling Trout Shoe, the local blacksmith, just 3 months earlier. On January 23rd, Trout left for work that morning, but he did something completely out of character. He kept stopping by young Andy Jones's house throughout the day, asking the boy to go check on Zona, make sure she was okay, see if she needed anything. Andy thought it was strange because Trout had never shown this kind of concern before, but eventually he agreed to walk over to the shoe house. When Andy arrived that afternoon, everything was eerily quiet. The house was dark, no smoke coming from the chimney despite the January cold, no sound of Zona's usual afternoon activities. He called out for her, but got no answer. Stepping inside, he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Zona was lying at the foot of the stairs, perfectly still, her legs together, one hand on her stomach, the other at her side, her eyes wide open staring at nothing. By the time Dr. George Knapp arrived an hour later, Trout was already there, cradling Zona's body, sobbing and carrying on in a way that made examination impossible. He'd carried her upstairs to the bedroom and dressed her himself in a high-necked dress with a stiff collar that completely covered her neck. He'd put a veil over her face, and when Dr. Knapp tried to examine her, Trout wouldn't let go of her head, rocking back and forth and wailing, making it impossible to properly check her neck area. Dr. Knapp noticed some bruising around the throat, but with Trout's hysterical behavior, he couldn't do a thorough examination. Frustrated and pressed for time, he wrote down the cause of death as everlasting faint, then changed it to complications from childbirth, even though there was no evidence Zona had been pregnant. At the funeral, Trout's behavior became even more suspicious. He wouldn't let anyone near the coffin, and he'd placed a pillow on one side of Zona's head and rolled up cloth on the other. He'd tied a large scarf around her neck, claiming it was her favorite. But when they moved the body to the cemetery, several people noticed something deeply disturbing. Zona's head flopped around in an unnatural way, like her neck was completely broken. Mary Jane Hester had suspected foul play from the moment she heard her daughter was dead. When they first brought her the news, she said something that made everyone in that small mountain community extremely uncomfortable. "The devil has killed her." After the burial, Mary Jane took home the sheet that had lined Zona's coffin, wanting something of her daughter's to keep close. What happened next defies every law of nature and common sense. When Mary Jane went to wash that sheet, according to her sworn testimony, the water turned blood red. She tried boiling it, scrubbing it with lye soap, hanging it in the mountain sun. The stain would not come out. And for the next 4 weeks, she prayed every single night, got on her knees and begged God to reveal the truth about what happened to her daughter. Late one night in February, her prayers were answered in the most impossible way imaginable. Mary Jane woke up to find a woman standing beside her bed. The room was ice cold, cold enough to see her breath, and the woman just stood there looking down at her. In the darkness, Mary Jane couldn't make out the face clearly, but something about the figure was heartbreakingly familiar. The woman returned the second night, and this time she spoke. Her voice was strange and distant, like it was coming from underwater or from very far away. She talked about being angry, about someone being furious about supper not being prepared properly. The third night, she came back again and was much clearer. She said her husband had been in a rage because there was no meat cooked for dinner, and he'd attacked her, grabbing her by the neck with such violence that it broke. The fourth night was the worst and the most specific. The woman was so close that Mary Jane could have reached out and touched her, and she told her everything in detail that would later prove to be forensically accurate. The spirit explained that Trout had squeezed her neck at the first joint, crushing her windpipe and snapping the vertebrae. Then, to demonstrate exactly what had been done to her, the spirit turned her head completely around, like an owl, showing Mary Jane the impossible angle of rotation that had killed her. The next morning, Mary Jane walked straight to Prosecutor John Preston's office and sat there for hours, telling him about these supernatural visits with a certainty and specificity that was impossible to ignore. Preston was skeptical, of course. Ghost testimony doesn't typically hold up in court, and he had a reputation to maintain. But Mary Jane was so detailed, so specific about the injuries, describing exactly how the neck was squeezed off at the first joint, and demonstrating the complete rotation, that he decided to humor her and send investigators to ask around. They talked to Dr. Knapp, who admitted his examination had been rushed and incomplete because of Trout's interference. They talked to neighbors who'd seen the strange way Zona's head had moved at the funeral. Most importantly, they discovered Trout's history. His first wife had divorced him for physical abuse, and his second wife had died under mysterious circumstances just 8 months into their marriage. 2 dead wives in 2 years was starting to look like a pattern rather than a coincidence. By the end of February 1897, Prosecutor Preston made a decision that shocked the entire community. He ordered Zona's body to be exhumed. They dug up her grave in the frozen ground, brought her body to the local schoolhouse, and 3 qualified doctors performed a complete autopsy while Trout was forced to attend and watch. As they began the examination, Trout muttered something under his breath that made everyone in that room freeze with horror. "They will not be able to prove I did it." The autopsy took several hours, and when it was completed, one of the doctors walked directly over to Trout with the findings. The neck was dislocated between the first and second vertebrae, exactly where Mary Jane said the spirit had told her. The windpipe was completely crushed, there were finger-shaped bruises on the throat, and ligaments were torn and ruptured. The doctor looked Trout straight in the eye and said simply, "We found that your wife's neck has been broken." Trout's response sealed his fate and confirmed Mary Jane's supernatural testimony. "They cannot prove that I did it." But they could, and they did. The trial began in June 1897, and Prosecutor Preston tried to focus on the medical evidence, avoiding mention of the ghost because he had scientific proof now. But when Mary Jane took the stand, The defense attorney made a crucial tactical error. Trying to discredit her testimony, he asked about her alleged supernatural visions. Mary Jane looked him directly in the eye and said with absolute conviction, "It was no dream. My daughter came back from the dead and told me exactly how she was murdered. She told me her neck was squeezed off at the first joint. She showed me by turning her head completely around, and when you dug her up, you found exactly what she said you'd find." The courtroom fell completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop in that mountain courthouse. The jury deliberated for exactly 1 hour and returned with a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Trout was sentenced to life in prison, where he died just 3 years later, some say from a broken neck suffered in a suspicious fall. After the trial, reporters and skeptics asked Mary Jane repeatedly if she really believed her daughter's ghost had visited her. She never wavered, not once, until her own death in 1916. Her answer was always the same: "I prayed for the truth, and the truth was given to me." The case of Zona Hester Shue remains the only case in United States legal history where testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer. It's known today as the Greenbrier Ghost case, and the historical marker still stands in West Virginia, commemorating the impossible. So what connects these 3 cases spanning a century? The murder of Rhonda Henson in Valdis, North Carolina, the highway rescue of Nick Skubish, and the Greenbrier ghost conviction all share something that challenges our understanding of reality itself. In each case, either the victim or someone who loved them experienced a phenomenon that revealed hidden truth, a foreboding feeling, a spectral sighting, a message from beyond death. These weren't vague premonitions or general feelings of unease. These were specific, detailed, accurate revelations that led to concrete results. Judy Henson knew the exact time her daughter died. Deborah Hoy saw Christine Skubish on a highway where she was physically impossible to be. Mary Jane Hester received forensically accurate details about her daughter's murder from beyond the grave. If you speak to people who have lived through such experiences, their convictions are absolute and unshakable. They don't claim to understand how or why it happened, but they know with complete certainty that it did happen. These stories, documented and verified, invite us to suspend our disbelief just long enough to wonder what if there really are dimensions of human consciousness we can't comprehend. What if the bond between parent and child, between people who love each other deeply, really can transcend the boundaries between life and death? What if there's something to premonitions after all, something that connects us in ways science hasn't figured out yet? The evidence is there, documented in police reports, court records, and hospital files. 3 cases, 3 impossible experiences, 3 times when the supernatural provided information that saved lives or delivered justice. Love and respect to all the families and individuals we've discussed today, whose experiences remind us that reality might be far stranger and more connected than we ever imagined. Because you made it this far, I want you to comment "premonition" below so I know who heard the whole story and who gave up when things got too weird. And if you want more deep dives into cases where the impossible becomes evidence, where the supernatural meets the documented, hit that subscribe button right now, because these stories are just the beginning of something much larger and more mysterious than any of us fully understand.